we have everybody good afternoon, everyone. It looks like we have everybody in the call. So we're going to get started. Thank you for joining today for our fourth panel of the Transitional Justice in the USA Speakers Series. I'm Lisa LaPlante, Director of the Center for International Law and Policy at New England Law, Boston, where I'm also Professor of Law. In collaboration with almost 40 other institutions across the nation, we launched the Speakers Series in the spring of 2021 in order to explore various themes related to the field of transitional justice as it relates to the current efforts in the United States to redress racial injustice, national attention to this important justice movement, while offering a critical lens to help inform our audience about this work. Of police contribute or distract from societal reckonings with racism. We'll explore the role of police accountability in racial reckoning in the United States and discuss both the potential benefits and limitations of prosecuting police for racial violence, and explores whether criminal accountability has lived up to its promise in other transitioning contexts to offer possible lessons for quests for retributive justice in the US. So I want to just acknowledge our planning committee. We have all our co-sponsors and often participants from each of them helping to plan that. You can see them listed in the right column. I'm not going to take up valuable discussion time, but thank you to all those individuals who helped with the planning, and in particular, Professor Rachel Lopez, who's an associate professor of law at Drexel University, and in her role as secretary of the AALS International Human Rights Section, as well as the co-chair of AZL's Transitional Justice and Rule of Law Interest Group. She's had a direct role in organizing this panel. The collaboration has been great, and I really look forward to the discussion. So she'll be moderating today, and I'm going to step back and take note of the discussion, and I hope all of you can engage a few just logistics. If you have questions, please post those in the question and answer panel. We have disabled the chat just for timekeeping purposes with the speakers. We'll open that up when we begin the discussion, but you're welcome to post questions as we begin. We look forward to a great discussion. This is being recorded and it will be posted on the website if any of you are not able to stay for the full time. Thank you so much, Rachel, for all your help organizing this, and I will give the floor to you.
Thank you so much, Lisa, and thank you so much for providing the venue for this and all the behind the scenes work that you've done to facilitate this panel. I want to start by just giving a little bit more of a background in terms of the impetus for this panel. Why are we addressing police accountability as possibly being a mechanism of transitional justice? And really the idea behind this panel was that we begin to see parallels between the debates regarding anti-Black police violence in the United States and those about criminal accountability, very familiar to the field of transitional justice, in which both scholars and activists have long debated the appropriate aim and reach of criminal punishment in transitioning societies. So to explain a little bit further, in the US, while many have celebrated the conviction of Derek Chauvin for the murder of George Floyd as a sign of progress, others have worried that it might be a distraction from the broader systemic change that is needed to combat racism and policing, and instead put the focus on a few bad apples. We see a similar split that has been long present in the field of transitional justice, with some arguing that there is a duty to prosecute all involved in gross human rights violations, and other critics arguing that instead, criminal punishment reinforces an individualized and decontextualized understanding of the harms and diminishes the likelihood of a more profound transformation. This panel will contextualize these debates by centering the role of police accountability in the much needed racial reckoning in the United States, and discuss both the benefits and limitations of prosecuting police for racial violence. In particular, this panel will explore whether criminal punishment and accountability has lived up to its promises in other transitional contexts like Guatemala, and what we can learn from those examples as we approach transitioning to a more just society in the United States. And I could not be more pleased to have an extraordinarily distinguished panel of experts and human rights activists. I'm going to keep my introductions brief in the interest of time, but I really encourage you to look at the incredible bios and experiences of all the panelists, which are linked on the TJ in the US series website. So, and just, I'm going to list them in the, and describe them in the order in which they will give their presentations in a moment. So first we have Darryl Heller. He is the director of the Indiana University South Bend Human Rights Heritage Center and assistant professor of women's and gender studies at Indiana University South Bend. Then we have Roxana Alotz, a clinical professor of law and co-director of the Human Rights Clinic at Berkeley Law School. We have Helen Mack Cheng, who is a human rights activist and president and founder of the Myrna Mack Foundation, and also was a police commissioner in Guatemala. And we have Nikki Grant, the policy and co-founder of Amistad Law Project. To get us started with the panel, I'm going to invite each speaker to present for approximately 10 minutes and to really dig deep into the main question that it frames this entire webinar. That question is, does criminal punishment of police contribute or distract from racial reckonings with racism? To start us off, we have Darryl Heller.
Great, thank you, Rachel. And it's wonderful to be here. And I now apologize to everyone for what may seem like a disembodied voice. My camera went kaput somehow this morning, but I'm really happy to be here. So yeah, I just have a few remarks to kind of frame my perspective on this. So a common understanding of police accountability is that gross injustices, such as the murder of George Floyd, is best served by the prosecution of offending police officers, in this case, Derek Chauvin, and the officers who participated in Floyd's murder. I believe that this is a simple understanding of accountability I believe that this simple understanding of accountability diverts us away from transformative possibilities by focusing on bad actors versus the systems and institutions that produce them. However, I don't believe that it has to be either or. I think we can and should look at it as a both and, that individual police officers who harm others are held to account, and that the institutions of which they are a part are also held accountable. I'm increasingly, for myself, thinking about accountability as having a capital A and a little a. Responses that demand individuals be held to account is accountability with a little a. But given the history of racist police killings of people of color, understanding justice as punishment for those acts is understandable. However, accountability with a capital A has to be held in tension with the need and demand for a form of transformative justice that not only focuses on individuals who harm others, but on the structures of power in which those actors operate. In the case of Derek Chauvin, he was operating with a clear differential power relation to George Floyd. That power was not his alone, however, but was situated in the institution of the Minneapolis Police Department and all the structures that comprise it, from the hierarchy in the department that includes the chief, sergeants, and supervisors on down, as well as the training and internal rules and regulations that are supposed to guide their behaviors toward the public. The police department, though, is but one component of the larger criminal legal system that includes prosecutors, judges, jails and prisons, probation officers, and others. And power doesn't end there. It also resides with the politicians and legislators who make criminal laws and policies. All of these have to be considered when addressing accountability. Racist power also operates in a more diffuse, though no less direct manner in cases such as the murder of Trayvon Martin and Ahmaud Arbery, who were murdered by non-state actors. Trayvon, a teenager who was simply out for a jog in Trayvon, who was simply out to buy candy, and Ahmaud Arbery, who was simply out for a jog, were accosted and killed by vigilantes who saw themselves as protecting the white racial order. In their minds, all Black bodies, especially those of Black men who they perceive to be out of place, is seen as a threat to be neutralized. This was also evident in Kenosha, Wisconsin, when Kyle Rittenhouse and a group of other white vigilantes showed up with assault rifles to protect white property against protesters who were marching for racial justice. Differential power relations in these cases is grounded in the ideology of white supremacy that has historically given white people the right to control the movements and activities of Black people, an ideology that dates back to slavery. This too is baked into the institutions and systems of our country. But ultimately, I think we'll have, and I think we'll get to this in our discussion, the question, does criminal punishment of police contribute or distract from societal reckonings with racism, needs to be reframed. Thinking about accountability and justice in terms of punishment leads us down the wrong road and ultimately leaves a punitive system that all too often creates additional harm intact. Punishing Derek Chauvin by sending him to jail may make us feel better, but it doesn't transform the system and set of values that criminalize Black bodies. It focuses on the actions of individuals as if they operate in a vacuum, divorced from social relations and institutions. It makes it easy to think that the system itself simply needs to be reformed, but is generally unbiased and colorblind. It leaves us believing that racism only exists within irrational individuals, or at worst, within aberrant groups. As is intimated by the subtext of this conversation, unless the bigger question of accountability with a capital A is addressed, it diverts us from a more substantial and necessary conversation. We can tweak the system by changing some rules and regulations to discourage behavior like Chauvin's, but we've been tweaking and reforming the criminal legal system since the days of the Black codes and convict leasing. Still, racially motivated murder and mayhem directed against Black people by state actors and others continues. Locking up individual police officers may be a useful immediate response, but a real societal reckoning with racism demands accountability across structures and institutions. While individual police officers may pull the trigger or kneel on the necks that lead to the killing of unarmed Black people, they operate within a larger framework. And importantly, the person killed is not the only person harmed in these instances. Families and communities are also affected. The imbalanced power relations that create a context for harms to take place has to be rebalanced through restoring right relations. So in addition to holding those individuals accountable, which I think we absolutely have to do, but we also have to ask the bigger and more important question of what else makes these racially motivated killings possible. Questions such as, what caused the harm and who has obligations to make it right? The answer surely isn't limited to just the actions of an individual. We have to work harder and take steps that involve acknowledging these larger harms, showing that we understand that a harm has taken place by expressing genuine remorse, repairing that harm in a way that promotes healing for all involved, and most importantly, transforming the underlying structures, systems, and institutions that produce that harm in the first place so that they are not repeated. All of these steps are necessary in order for a more sustained and healing justice context for everyone. So I'll leave it at that for now, but I look forward to joining in with others, in the bigger and deeper conversations that we're sure to have. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Heller. That was really incredibly powerful, and I like the idea of reframing the question as what causes the harm. We're going to turn now to Professor Alotz to answer our framing question.
Thank you so much. So I am going to try, I'm going to have to ask you all to let me share my screen. Yeah, it's still disabled. So while we fix that, so I just wanted to first thank the organizers. I wanted to thank Rachel in particular, who was kind enough to invite me to participate in the panel, but also to compile and share relevant scholarship, which I found really helpful to prepare for this presentation for the event. So in the next few minutes, I wanted to make 3 comments. The first related to the identity and motivations of victims of state violence in pursuing criminal accountability. The second is related to how criminal investigations and prosecutions, even unsuccessful ones, help us understand the systems of racialized violence and impunity that operate in the United States. And the third will be a quick comment related to prosecutorial politics and strategies, for which I'm going to briefly talk about different approaches in Latin America. I want to just, before I begin, quickly just say a couple words about my perspective. So oh great. So I hope you all can see that slide. Rachel, can you see that slide? Great. So I come to this discussion as a litigator. I sue governments, including the United States, on behalf of survivors and victims of state violence. And I'm going to draw on my experiences, not just with litigation against the United States, but also Latin America, because the long arm of the US law enforcement system looms large in this region in the entire region after decades of the so-called war on drugs and the long-term effort to criminalize migration. I also want to start by acknowledging that the United States has a racialized criminal legal system, and that criminal prosecution, as Dr. Heller said, excuse me, is really a maladaptive strategy that can exacerbate rather than address social and environmental issues. That the attitudes and understandings of justice are, of course, culturally informed, and in the United States, justice is often equated with days in prison, and that international law, including international human rights law and institutions, are part of post-colonial and imperialist legacies and have developed a decidedly criminal bent, perhaps most poignantly exemplified by the International Criminal Court. International human rights doctrine does hold out criminal prosecution as a superior form of accountability and the preferred option of survivors and victims. And criminal prosecution of human rights perpetrators is a demand, often a central demand, of many of the victims and survivors I've represented. Using criminal prosecution to advance justice admittedly has felt like trying to build a house with a wrench at times. The challenge, at least the way I've tried to face it with my colleagues and clients, has often been to try to use, bend, reshape that wrench to serve the interest of my clients, their communities, and the movements that they populate. The first contribution I wanted to make is to take a couple minutes to examine the identities, motivations, and goals of victims of state violence. Some of the literature Rachel shared that I read in preparation for this talk, I thought employed some tropes and stereotypes, some binary thinking and really superficial thinking to describe why and how victims and advocates pursue criminal accountability. Some of the articles depicted victims, survivors, and advocates as primarily motivated by retribution and vengeance. One of the articles, for example, characterized the calls for criminal accountability for police officers as personal vendettas against former oppressors, to argue that criminal prosecutions are fundamentally at odds with the aim of structural reform or transformative justice. Some of the articles asserted that what the proponents of prosecutions of law enforcement officials really want to see is those state officials suffer the same inhumanities of the carceral state as ordinary citizens. So I want to give a different perspective on the identity, motivations of victims and survivors of state violence by describing, and I'm going to refer to a particular case that I'm involved in, which focuses on state violence and impunity at the US-Mexico border. So let me just begin quickly by giving just a little bit of background. Customs and Border Protection, or CBP, which is housed within the Department of Homeland Security, has become the largest law enforcement agency in this country with over 60,000 agents. CBP agents have jurisdiction to act within 100 miles of any border or coast, which means CBP claims they have jurisdiction for their agents to enter private land without a warrant and ask anyone for documents anywhere highlighted in the light orange, which on this map, which I hope you can see from the slide, which is where 80% of the US population lives. I represent the family members of Anastasio Hernandez Rojas, who was a Mexican national, a father of 5, and a longtime resident of San Diego, a city that has more CBP agents than police officers. He was beaten to death by at least 17 Customs and Border Protection agents. How Anastasio was killed and how his death was covered up, we believe demonstrates that the system and not a few bad apples are responsible. Despite video and audio recordings of the incident and autopsies that ruled that the death was a homicide and documented extensive injuries Anastasio suffered as he was hogtied on the ground, beaten and tased multiple times, the Civil Rights Department of the Department of Justice closed the criminal investigation without pursuing any charges. And this is what I really wanted to get to, which is this slide. You will see that Anastasio's family members, in their own words, explain what motivates them to pursue criminal accountability. As undocumented and formerly incarcerated individuals, they are intimately familiar with the racialized violence of the US carceral state and are at great personal risk, demanding an impartial and independent criminal investigation of Anastasio's death. Their words communicate values and aspirations that go well beyond vengeance, beyond retribution. Their words, what they aspire to is truth. They seek to vindicate dignity, their own and Anastasio's. They strive to prevent additional violence. They seek repair of the breach of a fundamental social contract, which is breached when agents use the powers bestowed to them by the people to unlawfully and arbitrarily kill without consequence. While the desire for retribution and punishment is a legitimate response to state violence, the primary goals of most of my clients that I've represented in over 2 decades of practice has been to use the criminal legal system to know the truth, to dismantle the systems and structures that foster violence and impunity. Their calls for justice is also a galvanizing, a rallying call that has brought together diverse communities on both sides of the border. So the second observation I wanted to make is about how criminal investigations and prosecutions fit within the broader cause for justice, how prosecutions help us understand how the law has been deployed to punish Black and brown bodies and families and preserve a racial hierarchy. Here I want to make 2 points. The first is a bit doctrinal and the second is strategic. Under international human rights law, states that engage in violence, such as acts of torture, disappearances, killings, have an obligation to provide reparations to victims and their families for the harms they suffered and to ensure that the violation does not reoccur. While criminal prosecution is central to the human rights movement's efforts to address repression and violence, justice for the victims and their families require more than jail time. International courts have held that justice requires monetary compensation, medical and psychological care, educational scholarships, the construction of monuments and memorials to honor the memory of victims, and acknowledgement of wrongdoing and apologies from state officials, in addition to legal reforms, disclosure of state documents, training programs, and other measures. The cause of justice requires a constellation of interrelated and interdependent actions. I've never been part of a case or a cause where victims of state violence have sought only criminal prosecution of the perpetrators. In Anastasio's case, we've urged the international body that we're appearing before to instruct the United States to conduct a timely, independent investigation of Anastasio's death and the obstruction of justice that followed. We've asked that they instruct the United States to disclose publicly state records, to amend use of force laws and policies, to enact legislation to criminalize torture because it's not criminalized when committed within the United States, to publicly acknowledge and apologize, and to provide health and educational assistance to Anastasio, among other measures. The criminal investigation and possible prosecution of CBP agents is much more than the personal pathologies of the defendants. The investigations also have the potential to expose and reveal information about systemic features that foster violence. We've used the flawed, biased criminal investigation into Anastasio's death to expose how the gears of systemic violence and impunity turn at the US-Mexico border. The criminal investigation left breadcrumbs that we followed to discover that for decades, Border Patrol has been sending special teams to the crime scene of death and other serious incidents, and charged these teams with mitigating and concealing the culpability of agents. Members of this kinds of teams intervened in the criminal investigation of Anastasio's death and have acted to withhold, destroy, corrupt, and tamper with witnesses. And they did this in Anastasio's case, and they've been doing it for decades. Although imperfect and flawed, criminal investigations and prosecutions are sometimes the only way to obtain certain information about what happened and why. So very quickly, my last observation about prosecutorial strategy and politics. Of course, who, when, and for what and how state officials are investigated and prosecuted for human rights violations is deeply political. The adversarial zero-sum nature of the US criminal system poses unique impediments to using criminal law to address human rights atrocities. US prosecutors very rarely bring criminal charges against law enforcement. Federal prosecutors, in fact, have never brought a successful prosecution against a Border Patrol agent for a killing in the agency's 90-year history. But here I'd like to say that whether charges are brought is not the only issue. In many countries where I've worked in Latin America, criminal prosecutions of human rights perpetrators have been spearheaded by private prosecutors who represent the interests of victims and their families and have standing to initiate and intervene directly in criminal proceedings. These victim-led prosecutions have been focused on context and institutional forces driving violence in a way that I've never seen in the United States. In the US, the investigation of officers who used force is significant. But one thing that we're really seeing in Anastasio's case is there's a systemic effort, an institutional effort to cover up these crimes, obstruct and conceal civil and criminal liability, which also needs to be exposed and investigated. And I'll end there. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I really appreciated how you illuminated all of the myriad of ways in which victims try to seek accountability and not expose us to sort of, I think you problematize a little bit some of the tropes that exist and recalling sort of what victims want. And that's something that is really, I think, critical to this discussion. Now we're going to turn to Helen Mac Chang. She's joining us from Mexico. And we're hopeful maybe we could start with the video, though she's also having some connectivity challenges. So if that doesn't work, then we'll go back to no video. But Helen, do you mind just starting with the video at first, and then we'll see how it goes?
Yeah, thank you. Well, thank you, first of all, for inviting me to this panel. Of course, our experience in Latin America, or especially in Central America, is very different from the United States. I think that all cultures have racism and classism also. So I just have to give some of my background. I am Chinese. I am also immigrant, and my sister was killed by the security forces, especially the army. But at the same time, the police officer who did the investigation was also killed. But at the same time, there were also policemen who killed the police who did the investigation. And I felt this kind of guilt, because around the whole seeking justice for my sister, the policeman, the detective who did the investigation was killed, and 3 of the policemen had to went into exile. So I did a promise to do something for the police and try to understand what police are, because for us, and I think in many countries, the security issue is very controversial. In one hand, you want security because that's one of the human, rights that you have. It's that the state can guarantee you some security. And on the other hand, security sometimes means repression. So they become perpetrators. So you have this kind of, you have kind of contradictions there. What is what you want and what is the
My apologies, hon, cutting out. If you want to stop your video, my apologies.
Yeah, so I think that everything depends on also in which part of the social level you are, because that also depends, because always poverty, it has many prejudices. And when we're talking in low classes, you don't have access also to human rights like education, security, work. You have many of your rights are vedados. You don't have access to those. And so what you have to do as a human being is to survive. And that's when you commit some crimes. And then when there is also condena. There are many other peoples in other statements that you would say, you start with this kind of prejudices. Yes, immigrants just come here. Trump said that we were shithole countries, and so we need to be, separate, and we should be dead. You have to make a condena to those words, but that's kind of the prejudice that you're living. But if you talk also because that becomes also one part of the, I would say one part of the political issue about you want immigrants, you don't want immigrants, and those has to do with elections. But in the deepest, you do the same practices with immigrants. It doesn't matter, because that's a foreign policy, and it's just solo es una cuestión de it's just words on how you want to get elections to be done. But in our countries, there is also prejudice, because the difference between a policeman and a gang member is just a wall, because the policeman is just the same level, social level, as the policeman or the gang member, and they are in survival. So in our countries, many of these policemen are also part of the to do that dirty work that the other officers or police officers or don't want to do it. So these poor agents, or what we call them, they have to pay for the dirty, they have to do the dirty work, and they have to pay for the mistakes that they commit because they don't have their education. So it's very controversial. As I said, in my case, and I got to know, and that's why I became commissioner for the police reform. And really, when I accept this work because I thought that the police also need some dignification as human beings. And the many policemen came to me and they say, we appreciate what you're going to do. We're going to support you, but you're going to lose. Because there are many economic interests, corruption interests that won't be able to do the police reform. In Guatemala, the police is not recognized, not even for the Constitution, because everything has to do with corruption, because that is having control over budgeting, over security contracts, over, for the economic sector, is how do I use the police to, ¿cómo se dice? Desalojos, para desalojar las fincas. And they are doing it with their own.
To evict from
¿Cómo
farms.
se dice?
Desalojo, evict.
Well, I think the Wi-Fi is not stable. So I think that, are we back? Are we back?
You're good. We gotcha.
Yeah. And in those desalojos is where sometimes you kill people, or when you are repressing manifestations, you kill people. So, but those are instructions that are received by the highest ranking people. Maybe sometimes not even for the police, is given by the army in Guatemala, or by the political authorities. But they and the police know that they have to pay and go to jail if something goes wrong. So I think it is, I don't know, and I have these discussions because sometimes we have also evil people as police officers or policemen, because the selection of the policemen is not the best. But poor people needs to go to the police because it's the easiest way to get a job, is being a policeman, and you have to pay for it, and you have the minimum wage. So I think that at least in countries like ours, justice is not the solution. Nobody cares if a policeman is convicted, because they know that the police won't change. And things like that, and for example, during the internal conflict, same thing happened with soldiers. Who were the ones who did the massacres? Were soldiers by instructions of the police officers. And so when we were in the peace process, the idea of because they were using indigenous people killing their own people. So that's why organizations, widow organizations say, no, we don't want more reclutamiento forzoso, but we want libertad de conciencia. And that's how, because it's always involving their own families, because as I said, there is no difference between a policeman and a gang member, or a soldier with another. So what I want to say is, not necessarily, and I'm sorry for this because I really believe in justice, but not necessarily in the tension between the discussion of my security and justice. There is a tension there that we have to keep discussing, and it's not easy. So thank you, and sorry for not giving a concrete answer for transitional justice in security.
No, I think, Helen Mack, your comments were so pointed and so important. I really was reflecting on how you place the police within, there's a broader racial and class structure of the state, and how the police fit in that in Guatemala. I think that we can draw some lessons about that as we examine this issue in the US. So thank you so much for your really insightful contributions. Last, but certainly not least, we have Nikki Grant, who's going to take us away with the last presentation.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much, Rachel, for inviting me to be part of this panel. It's really an honor to be among these brilliant panelists, and I hope I can add to this conversation. I'm going to try to keep this short because I want to get to the discussion later. So the question presented to us is, does criminal prosecution of police distract or contribute to our society's reckoning of racism? And the answer, unfortunately, is that it's complicated. I'm a prison industrial complex abolitionist. I hope we'll talk about that more later. But this is a question that abolitionists struggle with. Yes, police prosecutions absolutely are a distraction, but no, we can't not try to hold police accountable in the ways that are available to us. And we have to be real about what prosecuting police gets us and what the cost is. So the uprising that happened after the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis were a racial reckoning unlike we had ever seen in this country. After Trayvon, after Eric Garner, after Mike Brown, after Tamir Rice, after Sandra Bland, after Freddie Gray, after Philando Castile, after Breonna Taylor, all these outrageous murders of Black people at the hands of cops and wannabe cops that sparked national outrage. Right? It was Derek Chauvin killing Mr. Floyd in front of everyone that caused many people for the first time to consider that maybe the police or an institution that could not be reformed. It was the first time that I recall in my work over the past decade ever hearing defund the police, not as a fringe, but as a mainstream demand. Simultaneously, the unthinkable happened and Chauvin was actually indicted and made to stand trial for what he did. What do we have now? A year later, Chauvin was convicted, but the political establishment pushed the idea of funding police back to the fringes. We're back talking about small reforms. And Chauvin's in prison. We're at a place in America where school boards are banning critical race theory. I do think that there is reason to hope. I know that folks were disappointed that the Minneapolis measure that happened after an uprising that would have replaced the police department with a Department of Public Safety. I didn't pass, but what organizers accomplished there was truly remarkable. They convinced 40% of their neighbors to acknowledge that the police weren't working and to embrace a vision of public safety they had never seen. That simply hasn't happened before. We should be looking at that not as a loss, but as a marker of how much work we have to do and that we're actually farther along than we think. A major challenge is how entrenched the system is. Some of this feels incredibly hard. After the Flint uprisings, when we made it untenable for Philadelphia to give the police department a nearly $20 million budget increase, they got that money right back and then some during the mid-year budget transfer ordinance. And in October 2020, Philly police murdered Walter Wallace Jr., a young Black man who was having a mental health crisis in front of his family and his neighbors. So at Amistad, where I work, we've been demanding unarmed first responders to mental health crises in the form of a fully functional mobile crisis infrastructure. However, so far, the city has given us police co-responders, where the police officers prepare for mental health specialists. And the city has also increased the police budget to arm cops with more tasers. So we're in a kind of unique position in Philadelphia, where we have a district attorney who is willing to prosecute police and often attempts to do so. And without going into the thorny issue of the idea of progressive prosecution, this is why I say that the question is complicated. Because if we understand that prosecution is the only thing that the system is willing to give us, but it continues to become difficult to even do that, then that also gives us a benchmark of how far we have to go. We have a more recent example in Philly of a judge who dismissed charges against 2 police officers who assaulted a young disabled man. I think it's cases like these that are useful in helping the public understand how horribly entrenched and unreliable these systems are. So I actually want to stop there and we might get to the discussion. Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you so much, Nikki. I was reflecting as you were talking about this idea that I think movement lawyers often talk about courtrooms as forums for resistance or for protest. And I think that your comments really illuminate the possibility of using criminal courtrooms, not for the purposes of seeking retribution, but rather to demonstrate really the sort of power structures that are at play. And in very clear-cut cases, oftentimes there are not the type of criminal justice that we would hope for. And what does that say about where we need to focus our efforts, I think is a really important ongoing question. As Nikki alluded to, we're going to turn in the next moment to a facilitated discussion amongst our panelists. I have a set of questions that I've developed alongside the panelists, but I also really encourage those of you in the audience to put questions in the chat, and we will turn to those questions in a moment as well, and also open up the discussion with our audience members. But to start us off, I want to turn a bit to the question of context. So as we've discussed, the purpose of this panel really is to look at what are some of the similarities between the transitional justice and human rights movements abroad and their pursuit of criminal prosecutions, particularly of police, and also the movement towards more accountability for anti-Black police violence. And so I want to talk for a minute because I think there's also possibly some challenges or a possibility that we might conflate some of the issues. And so I want to focus for a minute on context and the importance of context. And I'm going to turn this first question to Nikki and Helen. As we evaluate what the appropriate reach of criminal punishment is, specifically the punishment of police, how much do you think that contexts matter? So for example, as many of the panelists have discussed, we have a very chronic problem of over-incarceration, particularly of Black men. And a question that arises for me is, should the central question of this webinar, in other words, does criminal punishment of police contribute or distract from social reckonings with racism, should that question be answered differently in a country like the US versus a country like Helen Mack's country, Guatemala, where there's an average of, an annual average of 94% of crimes going unpunished over the last decade? Does that context of over-incarceration versus complete impunity matter for answering these questions? And we'll start with Nikki. You're on mute.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, context is very important, especially understanding our structural problems. And as I said, also understanding the ones who did the law is what they want, because that's part of the racism and the classism that you live in insecurity issues. And I say always poor people or the lowest classes has to pay for the mistakes or what the orders they give in the highest level. In our case, the internal conflict, the armed internal conflict the idea was to close the gap between the poverty, because those were the origin of the internal conflict. We signed 12 peace agreements, and the substantive agreements were not implemented. For example, the economic agreement was not implemented. The role of the army in the civil society that include the transformation or the reforms of the justice system and the security system. They did what it was possible to do and what they wanted, but the real issue were not implemented. For example, As I was saying at the beginning, the recognition of the police is not recognized in the Constitution because they want to keep the system, privileged system that is corruption, to have the control over the police budgeting. They don't want to change, and that's when my whole idea of becoming a police commissioner was to change, for example, the doctrine, because the doctrine or the philosophy, because the army philosophy cannot be the same as the police philosophy. For the army, and that was happening in the beginning, is civilians are the enemies and you have to kill them. Policeman has to protect the civilians. So there is a contradiction there. But for the army, and they have the control over the policeman, at least in Guatemala, they don't want to change the philosophy of security. And that is very important because it's how you teach to the policeman to keep security. If you are going to teach them that civilians are the enemy, of course they're going to kill them. If you're going to teach them that in the academy, you're going to teach them immigrants are criminals, of course they're going to kill them. And of course they're going to have the impunity. And of course they're not going to be indicted, because that's the mission they give to the security forces. Security forces move by missions. For the army, they don't care if you kill people. For the police, if you don't, there are some indicators if you are efficient or not efficient. So also depends on the higher level, what are the indicators that I am going to evaluate if you are efficient or not efficient, or you're professional or not professional. If they are going to measure that you are a good policeman of how many people you put in jail, of course they're going to get all the people that are living on the streets. I mean, the homeless people, the ones who drinks, the ones that are drug addicts, because that's the way they will evaluate him if he is efficient or not efficient. So I think philosophy, or the doctrines, as we say, it is very important. And I think that the supervision of civilians over how do they teach to in the academy to the security forces are very important, because that's how they teach them, and that's why they getting impunity. All the records that Roxana was giving of the 90% that they are in impunity, of they're indicted, and nobody gets, because those were the orders. So why am I going to put them in jail, go through this justice system? It will, when you don't have any more, there is a social pressure over the institution. But what you really have to do, if we want to go to the deepest, is how they are teaching to the police, to the different kind of police, what their mission will be. So if the CVP, it's you have to get all the illegals and you have to kill them because they are criminals, they are going to do it. And that's why they are not responsible, because that's the mission they gave. If for the police in one police station, they will say, Black people are haraganes, they are drug addicts, they are drinkers, they do, and also and the Hispanic people is also the same. That's why they are not going to be guilty, because those are the instructions. So I think that's why sometimes justice, as a transitional justice, is not going to satisfy what civil society wants. I think that's part of the discussion that we have to have. And the other thing is, what interest am I defending? Because all these, as I said at the beginning, all these substantial peace agreements were not implemented because for the elite, they don't want to change things. They just really don't want it. And yeah, you can have the debate, you can do the blah, 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 blah. It's just blah, 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 blah. But in the deepest, they don't want to change the system. So, and also we have to understand, I just want to make a difference, that it's not the same, the human rights violations in internal conflicts or in wars, like in common crimes. So I'm saying this because in human rights violations, my sister was killed. It was an extrajudicial killing. So sometimes in countries like Guatemala, for example, we don't have threats like the US have threats. We don't have Iraq. We don't care about Ukraine or Russia or China. So that's why they invent their enemies, and that's why they're cruel with our civilians, with our people, killing our own people. And I think that human rights violations, you suffer in the sense that they are, for example, torture. It's forever. A survival of torture is forever. You won't never can overcome the torture sometimes, or the disappearance. And even extrajudicial killing, even you have the opportunity to have duelo, to close some of your circles. So what I'm trying to say that we have more trayectoria in human rights violations and in common crime. That I say it's very controversial. I think those are part of the challenges and the tensions that we have to discuss. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Helen. One thing I wanted to draw out is this idea, I think, that might resonate with Nikki as well, of changing the philosophy of security. And so I really wonder if that resonated with you, Nikki, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this question.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I'm thinking about it, and the context like absolutely matters, like for how you approach the problems, but like I'm actually not even sure it changes the answer, because these issues are global, but in the US, like US is like an outlier in so many ways. Like it can't be understated how demoralizing it is for Black American communities to see Black people be disproportionately arrested and incarcerated for anything, and then the state get away with everything. I mean, given this country's shameful racial history, from Jim Crow to the fact that in Philadelphia is the world leader in people sentenced to life without parole as juveniles. But I mean, the first thing to recognize is that anti-Blackness is a global issue, as we have unfortunately seen as with African immigrants at the Ukraine and Poland border this weekend. Anti-Blackness is exhausting. But beyond that, you get out of the US and we're still talking about countries that have had to deal with colonization and state actors who don't face any kind of accountability, like Tom was talking about. So to me, it makes sense that in either instance, you try to get the accountability that the state recognizes, and at the same time, try to dismantle these systems.
Thank you so much, Nikki. And now I'm going to turn and if it's okay with you, Roxana and Darryl, use your first names going forward as opposed to your professorial titles. But this is sort of a related question. As we evaluate the efficiency of criminal punishment more broadly, does it matter who's being punished and what they're being punished for? And I think this kind of draws a bit on the discussion we had with Nikki and Helen. For example, do you think that it's different to punish powerful state officials like General Augusto Pinochet in Chile or Rios Montt in Guatemala, who are responsible for gross violations of human rights, as compared to punishing someone like George Floyd, who just allegedly bought cigarettes with a counterfeit $200 bill? Or do you think that this is a problem of disparity of punishment, considering the acts involved? We'll turn first to Darryl.
Thank you, Rachel. To answer your question, I think we have to shift the paradigm somewhat from punishment to accountability. And I think that accountability really requires or has to take into consideration the harm that is done. I mean, there's not, I think that the magnitude of the harm, the breadth and the number of people affected. So, clearly in some ways, the kind of mass murder of someone like Pinochet or, many other actors around the world require a particular kind of accountability that's very different than, say, George Floyd passing a $20 bill and paying for that with his life. the issue I think that needs to be considered in answering this question is really what kind of repair and what is necessary to heal the harm that's been produced. And I think that the answer to that question really requires the participation of those that have experienced that harm. I mean, I think as Nikki and others were saying, and I think Roxanne, I think it was really helpful, like your presentation, like it requires a constellation of actions. And those constellation of actions really requires the people who have paid the price and those who've been at the receiving end to have a voice in shaping the responses. But ultimately, at the end of the day, I think if we're going to have any kind of transformative justice that does address healing versus punishment, that really is about repair rather than vindictiveness, we have to broaden the lens in which we're looking at it. In that, because when we talk about punishment, particularly in the U.S. sector, and so this is something that I've learned from Danielle Surratt, and particularly in her book Until We Reckon, that our form of punishment, like we respond to violence by punishing people and putting them into a violent environment. like as she noted that the very what we think of as a cure for violence is actually just reinforcing and reinscribing violence, not only on the people that were the perpetrators, but also those that were harmed. And if we don't include those who were harmed, in our criminal legal system, we often exclude the person who was harmed from even participating in the kinds of repair that the state takes over. But it doesn't address the bigger structural, systemic, and as importantly, the racial issues that are often underlying when there's people of color that are affected. And so we operate here in the US as if we don't have human rights violations happen in other parts of the world, right? But how deeply, you can't not notice or see the impact. I think Nikki did point this out, that the worldwide response to seeing the murder of George Floyd, and seeing that as a violation of his human rights. This wasn't just a criminal violation. This was a human rights violation. And so, what kind of punishment, repair, healing is necessary? I think we have to. Context does matter, but I think that it's also very important that we think about this in a way that is about transforming the structures that produce it, and not just leave it located as the actions between individuals or the action of a bad state actor like Pinochet, who we also have to not forget that those kinds of international bad actors are also supported by governments like the United States. And so who's accountable for those? Sure, it's the person who actually pulled the trigger or that did the mass murder, but where are they getting their support? Who's benefiting from it? Like what are the institutional structures that made it possible and condoned it? Like, unless we're asking all of these questions and looking at, a solution or a way of addressing it that accounts for all of those various components, then I think we're still operating too narrowly. So context matters, and we have to break somewhere, I think, the paradigm of punishment to accountability and repair and healing. And I think unless we move in that direction, we leave intact structures that will just continue to perpetrate harms in different forms. So I'll ask Roxana to give her thoughts, but that's some of where I'm thinking.
Thank you, Darryl. I mean, I really agree, and I don't know how much I have more to add to what you said. I guess one thing I would like to focus on is just the difference between a common crime, which I think Helen mentioned, and a human rights violation in terms of the role of the state. So when you look at someone like Álvaro Uribe in Colombia, or Augusto Pinochet in Chile, or Ríos Montt in Guatemala, or George Bush in the United States. These are individuals who use the power of the state to enact atrocities. And I think, that's different. That is very different than an individual passing a $20 bill to buy, potentially counterfeit $20 bill to buy cigarettes. And I think that when we think about repair and reparations, we have to take into account that when state officials are involved in violence, the fracture that occurs, the breaking that occurs of a fundamental contract between leadership and society. I think the next thing I just add is the United States' disastrous record of holding human rights perpetrators to account. The United States is very good at telling other countries that as part of transitional justice, there must be a measure of accountability. But when has the United States ever held a human rights perpetrator accountable through an impartial and independent mechanism? So we think of 9/11 and the horrendous atrocities that were committed in the name of nationalism in the United States, and then Obama's decision, as he said, to turn the page with no accountability. And I think the United States, while it has a disastrous record of holding perpetrators to account, has a very long record of using criminal prosecutions to distract. And we can go back to Nuremberg, the kind of foundational event for transitional justice. So we have German perpetrators held to account, but there was never a conversation about the use of nuclear weapons against civilian populations by the United States. This country has a reckoning, which I think is only at its very beginning stages. I was listening to a radio program over the weekend honoring the anniversary of Trayvon Martin's death. And Paul Butler, who's an extraordinary scholar and former federal prosecutor who has come to an abolitionist awakening, I think is what he said. He said, we have to think in the long term, slavery went on for 400 years. Jim Crow took 100 years to dismantle. The new Jim Crow, the carceral state, may take just as long. And I think while we have to act to try to mitigate harm in the short term, we have to also think in the long term about what we're doing and how we can dismantle this new Jim Crow in this country, but realizing that it is going to take decades.
Thank you both so much. I found that to be really inspiring and so compelling. I want to turn now a bit to, I think, what was drawn out in a lot of your remarks, which is what really are we trying to accomplish by criminal punishment, and how might it intersect with other justice goals that we might have? And Helen, I'm going to turn first to you, and I want to give a little bit of the context as to why. Helen, just to let our audience members know, you were involved in one of the first successful prosecutions of grave crimes related to the armed conflict. And you were both involved in the successful prosecution of low-level officials and more higher-level officials. And so I think this really draws on both the comments of Darryl and Roxana in terms of what is the importance of power and the role of the state in these crimes. Should they be dealt with differently, and does power matter? And so I want to talk a bit about the lasting effects of the convictions that you were involved in. Did you feel like, for example, the convictions related to more high-level officials help to contribute to other justice goals in Guatemala, for example, racial justice, environmental justice, or redistribution of power and wealth? Or was power, were the criminal prosecutions incapable of achieving those results because of the power structures that existed that were essentially impenetrable to the convictions?
I think my computer was frozen, so I didn't hear very well. So Rox, can you help me in Spanish what you was trying to ask me? Because I just heard half. I'm sorry.
Creo que lo que ella está preguntando es sobre poder y cómo te sientes ahora es con relación a los juicios en Guatemala, los juicios penales, los esfuerzos de perseguir no solo los de bajo rango, pero los de alto rango por el asesinato de tu hermana. ¿Cómo te sientes sobre todo ese esfuerzo ahora? Y cómo la persecución penal de esos individuos ha contribuido a el desmantelamiento de los sistemas de poder, ¿o no? Creo que eso fue la pregunta.
Gracias. I think it's very hard. I think, Rox, we have talked this a long time. I think as a victim, and whatever you live, because we were under many threats, the personal cost was very high. And sometimes legal justice is not all the justice you want. Politically talking, and if you analyze the case as a strategic litigation, it was worth it. Sometimes in the personal level, it isn't, because one policeman was killed, like 6 witnesses had to flee and go into exile because of the threats. My father had suffered stroke. And so there are many things that sometimes you say it really is worth it to go for justice in circumstances like this. So, but if we see it and analyze if this helped to romper the power, it doesn't. It just, because they always will have the power, they just adjust the power, but not necessarily they understand, because they're always in power, and they like the power and they control the power. They will allow you to make the changes according of what they want, and you don't have to go through. For example, we can see it with CICIG. What had happened is that CICIG wanted to show that everybody is equal before law, and CICIG dare to touch presidents, former presidents, economic people, and now they are coming for revenge. And they say they do the same strategies that we use for strategic litigation in human rights violations. They're doing it for now for revenge, and revenge is not justice. And now they're putting in jail all the lawyers, all the prosecutors, all the judges that dare to question the system. So I say it's very, very controversial for me and as a victim to say, but it has a part of satisfaction because you got the justice. But if you compare what the effect in the personal for the family and for everything, it doesn't work. It's not. It is, but it isn't. And for in the political in the wider range, it was worth it because the case helped for tribunales to eliminate the criminal tribunals, el Estado Mayor Presidencial, who had these death squads, were dismantled. We could have the abuse of the amparo, that is for protection, a judicial protection, but they use it for abusive things. I think we put in on the table discussions about the role of the intelligence and the operative death squads. I think it was also important to have the figure, and this is very important in the transformation of justice, the figure of like a querellante adhesivo, what's kind of a plaintiff, and how NGOs, human rights NGOs can represent victims, that doesn't have money to pay lawyers. And that was, I think that's, it was a victory. So there are many things, for example, the access of information, for example, everything that I'm talking about, it's due for my sister's case. About the police, how can I wouldn't be able to understand and to explain the difference of philosophy between the army and the policeman. And sometimes you have to say that different. And I think that one way of doing accountable to the police is investigating how they are teaching, or in the academy, or the instructions they are giving for protection or security of the people, for example. Not necessarily has to be a case. As I'm saying, it's different when Rios Montt, or when Pinochet, or this military who had all the power of the state to go against civilians, innocent civilians, to kill them. So I think those are the differences and the issues that we have to discuss in order to have more justice. So as I say, I think there are strategic cases that are helpful for a wider objective. And then you have another discussion. So at the end, I say, yes, it was worth it, but the cost is, personal cost is very high. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Helen. And I think that your comments are so illuminating on so many levels, because they speak to both the personal costs involved with this prosecution, and the possibility that all of your efforts can be washed away, as was the case, and many people are saying is the case in Guatemala, right? So CICIG, just for our audience members, was a hybrid UN commission that was charged with, in many ways, supporting the Guatemalan government to reform, and also to help them to prosecute high-level officials for both narco trafficking, for corruption, and they had a lot of successes. In fact, they were able to successfully, in part because of the mass protests that resulted, but they found out that the current president, Perez Molina, was involved in corruption. And because of that discovery, people flooded the streets and demanded his resignation, and that actually occurred. And so to some extent, that can show that this is a remarkable achievement of criminal prosecution and the fact of it uncovering the truth. But as Helen pointed out, unfortunately, CICIG was kicked out, and now the people that were involved in CICIG are being, the tools of criminal prosecution are now being used against them. So I think that really speaks to the challenge of using these tools and how they can be used both for nefarious purposes and to seek broader truth. And I think this is actually a really great transition for a question I had for Nikki related to abolition and sort of what an abolitionist lens might tell us about some of these questions. So Nikki, your organization, Amistad Law Project, takes an expressively abolitionist approach to the criminal legal system. And there may be some in the audience who are not familiar with what abolition is. So I'm hoping that you could describe a little bit more about what abolition means to you and how it informs your views on the prosecution of police for anti-Black violence. And also to get to this tension that I think has been bubbling up, particularly with Roxana's comments about there are victims and survivors of anti-Black violence who really want criminal prosecution of those involved. And so how do you balance that with these broader advocacy goals that your organization is promoting?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So whenever I talk about abolition, I have to quote Ruth Wilson Gilmore, and she says, abolition is about presence, not absence. It's about creating life-affirming institutions. And I start with that quote because the idea of abolition is so misunderstood. People think, oh, you want to abolish the police, close the prisons, and let society just become wild and violent. But I don't want people to skip over that part about presence and creating life-affirming institutions, because it's foundational to how I think about my work and how I think we can get to a world without police. So at Amistad, we're making the argument that this isn't a utopian dream, but that abolition is tangible, concrete policy steps. It's making different choices about how we as a society spend our resources. And it's practical because it's only reasonable to stop and think that doesn't work. and build towards something that will actually work. So abolition requires that we have imagination and stop governing by fear, because it's fear of letting go of the way we've always seen things done, even if that's not actually true. Like, we haven't always had immigration and customs enforcement, ICE, in the US. We haven't always had police in prisons. These are modern inventions. But that's the design of the system, making it seem that the way things are the way they've always been and has to be. So like echoing what Roxanne had said, we consider that abolition will take time, like other abolitionist movements have. That's why we kind of straddle the center when it comes to police prosecutions, because what our actual goal is to use them as a mirror we hold up to society. Another challenge we have is trying not to replicate harmful systems in different ways. So we know that other institutions and industries have caused serious harm to our people. Like medical systems have been hugely oppressive. I'm thinking like of Black pregnant folk. And so our work with crisis expansion, we're not looking for a situation where unarmed civilians essentially become cops. So this process really requires us to be introspective and self-critical and really push ourselves, like, to think, okay, so this policy proposal we have, it's better than what we have now, but how can we imagine something that is better for our communities? And to answer specifically about balancing the demands of co-victims and survivors of police violence, for punishing police, we treat that similarly to all victims of violence, with respect, with empathy, with understanding that society shouldn't craft policy out of the worst instincts of people's pain. One of the many shameful things about our criminal legal system is that it offers victims so little. Like, it says, okay, you can have prosecution or you can have nothing at all. And that's unacceptable. Crime victims and victims of police violence deserve to see real accountability. And they also deserve to have the material needs met. And they deserve a system that will work to actually prevent them or anyone else from becoming a victim again. So that's how I view that.
Thank you so much, Nikki. I see that we are running short on time here. We only have about 5 minutes left, and I did have more questions, both for Darryl and Roxana, that I'm not sure that we'll be able to completely cover, but I wanted to make sure to also, give a chance for folks in the audience to have some questions. And I know there's a lot of interest in these broader questions. So let me just take a quick peek at the chat and then try to glean some questions. It may be that some of them have already been addressed, actually. So one of the questions that we had is related to sort of what occurs when police prosecutions do not result in prosecutions. And there's a question, I think, about what does that tell us about, and I think this gets to maybe a thought about courtrooms as forums for protest that Nikki discussed a bit earlier. But I'm curious to hear sort of, when we have all this weight put into the prosecution of a police officer, is it possible that I can see a couple of ways that this is both helpful and not helpful? On one hand, it shows us about the power structures that exist that prevent accountability of powerful actors. On the other hand, it can also, I think, unfortunately, put too much weight in the criminal legal system. And so I'd be curious to hear from the panelists about that question as well. And Darryl and Roxanne, I also wanted to get more to your work. I'd hope you had more of a chance to talk, but maybe in the closing, because I think we only have time for each of you potentially to answer the question. But I guess my sort of parting question for all of you, and I'm hoping that Darryl and Roxana can incorporate a bit of their work in the answer, is as we push for greater reckoning for racial injustice, both in the US and globally, where do you think we should focus our immediate efforts? And I'll ask you all to try as best you can to keep your answers brief to about a minute or so in the interest of time, because we are about to run over here. And we'll go start with Darryl and then Roxana, because we didn't get a chance to get to the final questions for the two of you.
Thank you, Rachel, and I'll be brief. I think kind of where, as we push the greater reckoning, where do we focus our immediate efforts? I think that what we have to do is build alternative institutions and resources. I think Nikki's absolutely right in how she talked about abolition, and that it requires shifting priorities in how we choose to spend our money and how those resources get allocated. I think that we have to be brave, and not live in fear. So just quickly, some of what we're doing here in South Bend, where I live, we've worked really hard to try to get police out of our public schools, SROs. And we lost that fight, by the way. The school corporation and the police department signed a new contract a couple of months ago. But that doesn't mean we're ending that fight, because we know that creating a safe learning environment for our young people in schools requires that they have resources that don't involve people with guns patrolling their hallways, but that it includes social workers, it includes school nurses, it includes interventionists, and folks who can give them the support both in the schools, but also in the communities in which they live. Simultaneously, we're also working to hold more accountability through building and creating a robust civilian review board, so that there is not just internal accountability of the police by the police, but that there's real people who are stakeholders in the communities that are also looking over that. The harms that have been perpetrated historically and currently, we have a reparations group that's really looking at some of the injustices. We're focusing particularly on housing right now, because like many other places in the country, residential segregation and the theft of generational wealth for Black people to pass on continues to fuel poverty and disparate resources. And ultimately, I think that what's really important across the board for all of us, wherever we are, is to be advocating for the kinds of alternatives for restorative and transitional justice in our communities and through the institutions, because we're living right now in the midst of a fairly significant backlash that is going to require that we redouble our effort, that we really take this not only to heart, but that we actually do the work of building the alternatives. So I know that the prosecutor in our county has said that that's not his job to build those alternatives, but if we come to him with alternatives, he actually would consider them. And so that we take that as part of the responsibility that we have, because that's the system's not built to restructure itself. It has to be restructured by us and for us. So I'll end it there.
Thank you so much. I think that in the interest of time, we'll give Roxanne the last word.
Oh, Lord. I was about to say, I like going after Dr. Heller, because I guess I would just end with the concept of buen vivir, which is a concept of thinking about systems that are community-centric, ecologically balanced, and culturally sensitive. So there's different systems at play, I think, that are creating a world where it's very difficult to live well. I wanted to link kind of the idea of the carceral state with also climate harm, because I think they are related, especially in this region, where we see the carceral state most violent against Black and Indigenous communities that are also the communities that bear the brunt of ecological disasters. And so, I mean, I don't have that much to add to Dr. Heller, other than to say, I think we have to be really attuned to how law and order politicians in the United States co-opt the moral authority of victims and use it to justify harsher sentences, more convictions, worse laws that are completely divorced from community well-being. And I think we need to have this more holistic view of what repair and reparations means, what accountability means, and that view should take into account this concept of good life, good living when vivid. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And in closing, I just want to express my tremendous gratitude to the panelists. I thought this was such an incredibly deep conversation that got past, I think, a lot of the binaries that really prevent us from addressing real solutions. So thank you so much. And we really appreciate it. And we look forward to the next installation of Transitional Justice in the US series. Thank you all so much. Bye now.
Thank you, everyone, for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you. Wonderful to meet everyone. Chao, Helen. Un abrazo grande. Cuídase.
Ciao,
Hablamos.
Helen. Muchas gracias. For those of you who are still on the call, we'll be posting the recording on the speakers series, and stay tuned for the next panel to be announced.